this whole YouTube podcasting thing is kind of confusing. So in this video, I want to show you how to set up a YouTube podcast because there's more than one way to do it. So you want to make sure you have it set up correctly from the very beginning. So let's pop over here to my YouTube channel. If you come up here to the top right under create, you're going to see new podcast, and it's going to give you a few different options. If you already have a podcast, an audio podcast, say it's hosted on a regular hosting company like Buzzsprout, for example, that's where I host my audio podcast, then you have an RSS feed already. And if you choose submit RSS feed, you enter your RSS feed, and there's a couple of steps you have to keep in mind there, but I'll show you that in just a second. One thing you have to realize about setting up your YouTube podcast with an existing RSS feed is your RSS feed is only going to be able to pull in audio podcast episodes. So we're talking about taking an audio podcast, bringing it in automatically through the RSS feed. YouTube does that for you. And then it creates a video using the static image of your podcast art along with the audio of your episode. Now, it's great that all happens automatically with an RSS feed. And if you're not interested in creating video podcast episodes to put on YouTube, then this is probably the best option for you, especially if you already have a podcast set up. You do have to jump through the verify ownership hoop to make this happen. So when you go to your podcast hosting company, there should be a setting in there to add your email address for verification purposes. And then when you put your RSS feed here into YouTube, it may take a few minutes, but then you'll move on to the verify ownership step where you get a code to your email address. And that way YouTube verifies that you are in fact the owner of this podcast or of this RSS feed. Your episodes are not going to be public. Your podcast is not going to be public. Everything is going to be in like a private mode so you can get everything set up and see how it works before, any of these podcast episodes are distributed anywhere. And once that process is done, you'll see your podcast here in the back end of YouTube under podcast. So let's pop back over here to YouTube and hit create again, new podcast. The other two options here are to set an existing playlist as a podcast or create a new podcast. So if you're planning to create video podcast episodes, then these two options are going to be for you. But it is a little confusing knowing which one to choose. So the weird thing about YouTube podcasts, and this is the question I see come up all the time, what exactly is the difference between a YouTube podcast and a YouTube playlist or a YouTube podcast episode and a YouTube video? And the answer is really, there isn't a difference. It's just that YouTube, in their effort to get in on this podcasting game, have decided to make it really simple and easy to just let their creators decide that if they have an existing playlist, for example, all you have to do is select one of them and decide that it's now a YouTube podcast. It's still YouTube videos, but because you would be designating it as a podcast, it's also going to show up in the YouTube Music app. And I sure hope that they change the name of that at some point. The third option here is to create a new podcast. So if we click this, it's asking for a title, a description, a thumbnail, and then you can choose your visibility in your sort order, and then you can add videos to it. So if you're setting up a podcast for the very first time, you haven't created any videos yet, you haven't recorded any episodes, and you want to put them on YouTube, and you're going to manually upload those videos to YouTube, this is the way you want to go. Just create a new podcast. Now, does this mean that when you upload a video podcast episode to your YouTube podcast, that episode can then be distributed to things like Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Castro and all of the other podcast players? No, it does not mean that. It means that it can be viewed on YouTube, viewed in the YouTube app, or listened to, and I guess viewed in the YouTube Music app. In my video that I did talking about whether or not video podcasting is the next big thing or not, I talked about how big of a can of worms this whole video podcasting and YouTube podcasting thing really is. And to tell you the truth, I think it's kind of meant to be a little bit confusing right now because the traditional podcast hosting companies, I don't think they want you to really use YouTube to distribute any of your content, because then why would you need a podcast host? And Spotify wants you to forget that YouTube and any other apps for consuming content even exist. And YouTube certainly doesn't want you to host your podcast episodes for free on YouTube and then distribute them to all of the podcast players without the viewer or listener listening or viewing them directly on YouTube. So if you're wondering what is even the point of putting my podcast on YouTube, well, YouTube is the most powerful way to grow your audience online because you have the power of this algorithm. It's a really great discovery platform. So if you want to reach the most amount of people, even if it's just an audio only podcast, but especially if you want to use video podcasting, then why wouldn't you want to be on YouTube? The downside is, in order to really maximize how many people you can reach with your content, the best option in the way that I do this is I upload my video directly to YouTube in my podcast playlist for the Video Brand Infusion podcast. And then I upload an audio version to Buzzsprout, and I let my RSS feed from Buzzsprout distribute the audio version to all of the other podcast players out there, including Spotify and Apple and everything else. I'm really still crossing my fingers and knocking on wood that one day it'll be just really simple and easy to upload a video podcast episode and have it distributed to all of the podcast players that support video podcasts, and it will go to all the players that just do audio as an audio version as well. One can dream, right? Because if you're creating podcast or video content for your business to grow your audience, to grow your community, to build your list, to generate revenue, then of course you want to be in front of as many people as you can. You want to distribute your content to as many people as you possibly can. And video content, video podcast, video marketing is, I think, a great way to do that. I mean, it works for me. And if you're watching this video, I think you're thinking that maybe YouTube is going to work for you too in your podcast content. Now, whether you have video podcasts, audio podcasts, or just regular YouTube videos, utilizing YouTube and letting the algorithm build your audience for you is really as simple as creating a library of binge-worthy videos on YouTube. When you put as much time and effort into your videos and podcast episodes as we do, you definitely want it to pay off for you and get some of that YouTube algorithm juice working for you. And if you're not totally sure how to do that, I break it down for you really simply over here. You can learn how to create a binge-worthy YouTube channel, even with your podcast content. And if you create content to grow your business, build your list, and generate revenue, you should also check out the Video Brand Infusion podcast here on YouTube or in any podcast player that you want, because that's exactly what we get started with in episode 1 of the Video Brand Infusion podcast.